All of that is absolutely wonderful. It provides a lot of opportunities in terms of our improving the profile of quality, risk, and cost that we have for our production, as well as helping, we hope, to expand our production into areas, especially fine-grained information, that otherwise we would not be able to provide. All of that's absolutely wonderful, and at the same time, we have to go beyond that blue sky idea about this could be something really good to spell out in depth what exactly should we do and how do we go about assessing the quality of the information that we produce. And our focus for all three of these workshops is one particular slice of that. What can and should we be saying about the quality of the information that we have? First workshop was focused on input data quality. Second workshop was focused on processing quality, and now the third workshop is focused on output data quality. So once again, welcome to everybody, and we're going to turn things over to Chris Chapman, who's going to give us a review of the first workshop.
Thanks, John, and speak into the microphone.
Every time I interrupt Chris.
It's okay, it's good.
Well, at least it's not
Get
in the
the
beginning.
right.
In the middle.
Yeah,
It's in the beginning. Okay, I think we have it figured out. And let me just put these little pancake mics in.
Sure.
All right, so we've got everything closed. All right, so. Yours is PowerPoint, right?
Yes.
PowerPoint. Oh. Okay. And let's see. We need to go to this guy, right?
Looks good.
Right. Hopefully it's working. All right, sorry.
Still Chris Chapman. And thank you again for coming this morning. And John, thanks for organizing everything, all the workshops. John's actually been a driving force getting us all organized. So to sort of give an overview of the first workshop, I want to first mention that after my brief introduction here, Joe will also give a short overview of the second workshop. I also want to do my standard disclaimer. I'm not representing the U.S. Department of Education in any official capacity, but I am representing a lot of work of my colleagues that organized the first workshop. Mark Felt from ERS, Polly Phelps and Nicole Nestoriak from BLS, Rolf Schmidt from Transportation, Renee Guinea from NCHS, and colleagues at JPSM, Alex Brown and Andrew Caparoso. Okay. So one of the things that helped us organize these workshops was actually a paper that was developed by CN staff. So I want to put a plug in for that report here this morning. It's called Innovations in Federal Statistics, Combining Data Sources While Protecting Privacy. It's free of charge at the National Academies, so please download the report if you haven't already done so. It has a compendium report along with it. So that said, I want to talk a little bit about the first workshop itself. We organized the first workshop really around administrative record data and then less structured or unstructured data. And those are concepts drawn directly from the CN staff report I mentioned. And we intentionally stayed away from talking about data quality of survey-based data collections. And that's primarily because as statistical agencies, we have a wealth of knowledge in that domain already. So we didn't really want to rehash the last century or so of quality indicators for sample survey data operations. We did want to talk about and focus in on types of data that we have less sort of standardized quality metrics for, and those include administrative record data and, as I mentioned, less structured or unstructured data. The morning session of the first workshop delved into the administrative record data that we have been integrating into our sample surveys now for quite some time. We have presentations across a range of topics, including information.
Mute on.
Primarily in terms of how administrative record data are used in official federal statistics, and Steve Cohen gave that presentation. Bonnie Murphy and Chris Balcani here at the Bureau of Labor Statistics gave a really nice overview of how they go about looking for sources of administrative record data to bring into the price index processes that BLS manages here. Mary Muth presented information about how scanning data and other types of information are gathered from commercial sources to help develop price models for groceries. And then Mike Benning and Dave Shepard did a really nice job from the Census Bureau talking about how in their unit they more broadly go about determining what types of administrative record data can be brought in and merged with sort of Census's standard survey operations. And they work through examples from a wide range of different collections that they've been working on at the Census Bureau. They have a whole unit that focuses on this. The presentations had a couple of common themes. The biggest one was making sure that no matter what, you find out exactly what the original purpose of the administrative record data collection was intended for before you try to bring those data into any operations that you've got underway. That means that you have to have a really good understanding of documentation that's available, so make sure you get as much of it as you possibly can. And then there was a common theme of basically challenges associated with getting that kind of information from private sources, primarily because private sources sometimes have proprietary restrictions on what they can share, and also the private sources are not designed actually to be transparent about how they produce their data, so when they change their models or how they collect data, it's not always transparent. Some cautions there. And then the afternoon session focused in on the less structured data. And these are primarily in the form of things like imagery and sensor data, text data, and other types of really much less structured information. We had presentations on health data again. This was done by Dr. Peter Elkin from the University of Buffalo. They've been doing some groundbreaking work there, merging data together, including image data from patients along with hospital records for patients, insurance information for patients, and doctor transcriptions for patients. So they've been really trying to pull all these different data sources together to better model health of patients coming through the University of Buffalo health system. David Johnson talked at length about how image data, and in particular satellite imagery, is being used by the USDA and some of the issues that are associated with changing technology with satellite imagery. Subrat Malhotra from the state of Maryland's Department of Transportation talked about how they are using road sensor data integrated with administrative record data and survey data to build better models of traffic across the state and how they use those data to drive policy. And then finally, Roberto Rigobon did a nice presentation on an example of web scraping. And in this case, it was in the context of product pricing and how to model that and predict it, and some of the challenges associated with that kind of modeling. There were several themes between the afternoon session and the morning session. Everybody kept driving home the point: make sure you understand why the data were collected in the first place, so you understand what their purpose of use is, so you don't try to misapply it. Common theme was also sometimes it's challenging to get information about how the data themselves are collected, particularly if you're trying to work with private sector vendors for these data. And then there was a much heavier focus on some issues around technology. And they all talked about the promise of technology in terms of being able to get data faster than you can get if there's a human interaction, if you're just using remote and technologically driven sensors. And then some of the challenges associated with those data, particularly as technology itself changes. So our next steps, and they should be wrapping up soon because we're going to give a presentation on some of these next week at FCSM. First, I want to finish a summary report that Alex has been working on for us, and that's very close to being done now. I think she's just waiting for comments from me, actually, at this point. We also want to complete some work that John Shaka has been leading on overviews of administrative record quality systems. And then we want to review the applicability of sort of a broader data quality model and how we could apply it to some real-world examples. And hopefully get some volunteers from that across the agencies. And then finally, you'll see a presentation from us again at SCSM late next week. So with that, I'm going to hand the mic over to Joe Schaefer, talk a little bit about the second workshop.
Okay, good morning, everyone. So I'm going to give a recap of the second workshop. And just as Chris said, my opinions are those of my own. So as John mentioned, we have organized 3 workshops on the general topic of reporting on the quality of integrated data. Chris just gave an overview of the first workshop, which was held at the beginning of December. That focused on the quality of the data going into the system, the input data. The second workshop, which was held late last month, was on the quality of the data processing steps. And workshop 3 is today, dealing with output data and also trying to synthesize themes from all 3 workshops. Okay. So when we talked about the second workshop, what we were going to cover, we had a prioritization of various topics that could be involved when you're talking about integrating data from multiple sources. And the various topics that we considered are listed here. We came up with 11 different areas, and we prioritized these topics from high to low, depending on what we thought was essential to be covered in the second workshop. And the 4 topics that we designated the highest priority were record linkage, statistical matching / data fusion, modeling, and imputation. Do I approve this, Wendy? Or decline? Okay. 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 Sorry, wherever you are. Okay. All right. So I'm not sure how to go back. This page up, page down doesn't seem to work. They're not. No. Okay.
It's Monday, right?
Yeah.
Okay, I think it was just maybe not in the work too.
Oh, that
Up
those.
here.
Okay.
Well, or page up, page down.
Yeah, page up, page down weren't working. Okay. So we came up with 4 areas that we thought were high priority. The first was record linkage. The second was statistical matching / data fusion / imputation-based methods for combining multiple data sets. The third topic, which was rather more loosely defined, was harmonization of information across the data sources. For example, what do you do when you're combining data sets where the variables are similar but not quite the same? And then the 4th area was disclosure avoidance. And what happens with disclosure avoidance techniques when you're in a multiple data set framework. So the first session, the first of 4 topic sessions, we devoted to record linkage, and we had a wonderful presentation by Rebecca Stortz from Duke University, and along with comments and discussion by Bill Winkler and a lively floor discussion after that. Some of the things that came up in Rebecca's and Bill's presentations, some of the key ideas, well, Rebecca covered various techniques for what she called entity resolution with noisy identifiers. Entity resolution is almost a synonym for record linkage. It's the idea where you have multiple data sets where individuals or units are being duplicated. Some of them are being duplicated across these data sources. How do you identify those entities that are being duplicated and resolve the issue of duplication? A lot of the techniques that she talked about were computationally intensive, and a lot of her work has been focused on finding easier, simpler, faster ways to do this. She did note that traditional methods going back decades, such as the Follegi-Sunter algorithm, are very difficult or impossible when you have more than 2 data sources. And a lot of difficulties abound, yet it's interesting at how much this is already being done at federal statistical agencies, even in large-scale projects, such as the preparation for the 2020 decennial census. Entity resolution and record linkage are figuring very prominently there. Some of the takeaway messages, and these are personally things that I learned that I thought were very interesting and useful, is that when you're doing this entity resolution / record linkage, there are some well-established quality metrics, such as precision and recall, that should probably be reported, estimated and reported as part of transparent reporting standards. Both of our speakers emphasize the importance of getting high-quality truth decks, and truth decks are, for example, hand-matched subsamples where the matches are considered to be true. And to use that both when you're doing supervised learning matching algorithms to apply to the rest of the data, and for quality evaluation purposes, estimating precision and recall. It is possible to estimate those errors without truth decks, but it becomes more complicated and much more subjective. One important message that Bill emphasized was that errors in the original data sources are additive, along with mistakes in the matching. And so if you're linking 2 data sets, one with a 5% error rate, another with a 5% error rate, and there's 5% errors in the matching, you're ended up with a combined data source with 15% errors. I'm not sure exactly how you make that rigorous, but he says it's rigorous. So things are additive. And the methodology for assessing how those errors are going to impact final estimates and final data products is still in its infancy. Some important work has been done, but a lot more needs to be done. The second topic session was on the area of harmonization, and that was rather loosely defined. We started by thinking, well, if you're combining multiple data sets, probably there are going to be different mode effects because they weren't collected in the same way. The variables might not be defined in exactly the same way. They might be measuring things in different time intervals, different levels of geography. And so how do you deal with those differences across the data sets? What we found is that harmonization, there's a lot of other issues too. For example, differences in the populations being covered. So differences in coverage, differences in non-response mechanisms across the data sets. And we need to think about all of those when we're doing combining. We had 3 presentations at this session and a floor discussion. We had Ben Rice from the Census Bureau, Don Jang from NORC, who's back with us today, and Scott Holland speaking remotely from the University of Missouri. Some of the key ideas that were covered is, well, Ben talked about how you might use a survey to adjust or improve estimates from administrative records. And that was a rather interesting talk. We usually think of administrative records as being used to improve a survey, but he wanted to go the other way. Don talked about a lot of different issues that come up when you're combining data from multiple surveys when they're dealing with similar populations and similar topics, for example, college graduates and degrees, to produce data products that add value when you combine. And he discussed a great many issues that come up when you're doing this combination. And Scott focused on modeling techniques for what he called the change of support problem to generate estimates for different levels of aggregation in space and time. So, for example, taking data collected in the American Community Survey to generate estimates for a 3-year time window, which are no longer being produced regularly by the Census Bureau. Some of the takeaway messages from this session, from my perspective, were one thing I learned, especially from the first two talks, was that when we talk about data quality and the quality of the input data and quality profiles of the various input data sources, which was mainly the focus of our first workshop, it's the very fact that those quality profiles vary from one data source to another that gives you the motivation for wanting to combine them. So, for example, in Ben's talk, he talked about how an administrative record data source might have really good coverage relative to a survey. Since it's not a sample, it covers it's a large data set that covers the population. But because the measurement is not as careful, perhaps, as with a high-quality survey, the data there could be more error-prone, more noisy, maybe more missing values that are unknown. And if you have a good quality survey, the sample size is much smaller, but certain key quality aspects are thought to be superior, and that becomes the primary motivation for combining with the administrative data set to improve the quality of that data. So since we're focused on, I think it's fair to say that the variation in quality profiles across data sources is a strength. It's not a weakness, but it's something we need to get a handle on. From Don's talk, I understood that harmonization is very hard work, but it can be made simpler if survey designers plan for it in advance. So in the traditional survey world, you plan your survey to do the best job that it can. But what Don is, one of the things he advocated for is to plan a survey with the understanding that ultimately this survey is going to be combined with other surveys. And that changes your thinking on a range of topics. From Scott's presentation, one of my takeaways was that estimates for different levels of aggregation may have very different quality characteristics, even if the data sources are the same. And he talked about this this problem, MAUP, I forget exactly what it stands for. It's also known as the ecological fallacy, which is that you start aggregating data up to different levels of geography, different timescales, and the error structures are quite different, even though the original data source is the same. But interestingly, he says that there is some theory for how to minimize the error, and he didn't have time to talk about it, but he pointed to some publications on that. And so I thought that was a very relevant message for us. The third topic session was on statistical matching, modeling, and imputation. The main presentation was by Jerry Ryder, who spoke remotely from Duke, with an in-person discussion by Ed Mulrow from NORC. And statistical matching is kind of the flip side of record linkage. In record linkage, you're trying to identify units from different data sets that do represent the same entity in the population. With statistical matching, you're combining data sets, understanding that the units in this data set are different from the units in this data set. They don't represent the same population entities, but they're drawn from the same population and they have similar statistical properties. And so you can combine these data sets perhaps by statistical matching, matching units that look similar on some background characteristics in order to build up a data set with more variables than you had from any one individual data source. One point that Jerry emphasized is that statistical matching, as most have been doing it, makes strong assumptions, traditionally the conditional independence assumption, that are not directly testable. So if you have one data set that has variables X and Y, another with variables X and Z, you match units on the X variables to get a combined data set and then fill in the holes in the missing, fill in the holes that way by this matching procedure. You're implicitly assuming that Y and Z are conditionally independent given X. And very rarely is that assessed. What happens if that's not true? We just assume it and go on, and sometimes we don't even say that we're assuming it. One of the things that Jerry strongly advocated was moving away from this algorithmic matching to more explicit modeling techniques based on, say, regression models. It doesn't solve the problem of having to make strong assumptions, but it does make it much, much easier to perform sensitivity analyses to see what happens if you depart from those assumptions. And once you're in the realm of explicit models, you can then do much more complicated and interesting things. So, for example, if you get a small subsample that has X, Y, and Z together, maybe it's not representative of the same population, but certain aspects of the joint distribution from that auxiliary data set could be used as glue to improve the quality of the combination of the other two data sets. And that's a very interesting idea. I find it very compelling. Some of the takeaway messages, I believe that Bayesian multivariate models are a very promising theoretical framework for combining data sets in this non-record linkage realm. And I believe that Raghu's presentation this morning is going to focus on that as well. Based on what I've seen, I don't think that these models yet incorporate our full understanding of the different quality profiles of the different data sources. These models are still relatively crude in that they're, for example, supposing that the units in the two different data sets or multiple data sets are being drawn from the same population. If they don't yet recognize that there might be variations among the characteristics of the populations and of the finite populations that you're trying to draw inference to. So issues of coverage might not quite be the same. I believe that these techniques can be expanded in the future. To do that, it shouldn't be too intractable, but it's an important and, I think, promising area for future research. Finally, we had a session on disclosure avoidance, and we're very pleased to have an in-person presentation by LaTanya Sweeney of Harvard, and a discussion remotely by John Aboud from the Census Bureau. Some of the key ideas, both in LaTanya's and John's presentations, LaTanya made a point that there's not necessarily a direct trade-off between data utility and confidentiality protection. So in her view, the old idea that you have to trade off some data utility to protect confidentiality or vice versa is not always true, and you can improve both at the same time and find a so-called sweet spot where you're doing better in both. In her work, she's shown that current best practices, in quotes, especially at the state level, are still very vulnerable to re-identification. And she advocates a system of continuous improvement where people are continually trying to break the system and based on what they find, then improve the system. Some of the takeaway messages, one that was really stressed by John, was that adding random noise really is, to our data really is going to be necessary to overcome consequences of the so-called database reconstruction theorem, that adding random variables whose distribution is statistically independent of anything else in the data really isn't a necessary condition to avoid database reconstruction possibility. The positive aspect of this is that once you do that, the error properties are fully quantifiable, and we can also be fully transparent about the method. John believes that the era where we can say, well, we did something, applied some procedures to these data for the purposes of disclosure avoidance, and we're not going to tell you what those procedures were. He believes that those days are over. We need to be transparent about what we did so that people understand the error properties of the data that they're analyzing. Another point that came up was that the risk of disclosure depends on, it does depend on the properties of any given data set that you're releasing, but it also depends on everything else that has already been released into the public. And so we have to pay attention to the so-called privacy budget, that we can't expend all of our marbles on this data release, because that may preclude our ability to release more in the future. That's more important. And both LaTanya and John emphasized that the recent work by the Commission on Evidence-Based Policymaking should provide an excellent guide. The guidance that they provide is very sound, and we need to be looking at that. And I believe that we are done. Are we going to go directly into the next session? Okay, great.
Well, welcome to this third workshop. I think we have some interesting talks for you today, and we will be emphasizing output data quality, but also kind of what do we do now? I want to recognize, I've been heard several times I organized this, but it was actually a group effort. And these are the people who are involved in the subgroup that help determine the program and help think about things. And would you guys at least wave your hands, if not stand up, so people recognize who you are? And I hope you'll give them credit when you like it and talk to me when you don't like it. One of the things that Paul Mark and John Popham did early was talk about levels of transparency. And we thought about focusing the workshop in this way. In the end, we went a different direction, but I do think it's helpful for us to think about. The first is high transparency. In other words, you have all the information you need to validate the results. And the limitations in the methodology or the supporting data are known. It's the underpinning of other forms of transparency and would be of interest to academics, agency specialists, and subject matter experts. So if they really, now, for most of us working in government, we couldn't actually give them the data, but they could conceptually go through the analysis. Then there's moderate transparency, where you just have the key high-value transparency information. Close details aren't immediately displayed, but you should be able to unveil the high transparency information. So if they got to a point they really needed to know more, they could do so. And the audience would be more like policymakers, professional journalists, and students. And then low transparency, where most people live. Limited, detailed transparency information. Easy to navigate and understand. And if they wanted to, again, they could go deeper, but the audience would be more like the general public. And as we started hearing through the first two workshops, it became obvious that we are so busy figuring out what to do with this data that aren't necessarily survey data, we haven't even thought to a great extent, with few exceptions, there are a few exceptions, about the quality metrics. So there have been several speakers that they were busy. They showed us how they were doing it. And afterwards, we had a conversation, and I said, so what kind of quality metrics do you think we could use there? And the response was, haven't thought about that. Okay? So this is the role that we're trying to place here, is to kind of start thinking about that. What should be the quality metrics that we have as standards? For this workshop, we're going to look at this output data quality. First, the break-in data theory. Lynn Langton, as Bureau of Justice Statistics, will be talking about some of their experiences at BLS, and it's not necessarily, it's more a change of design than using different data sources, but the issues are the same. And John Elting had some experience with that when he was from BLS, and he is now at Census, and will be talking about some of his experiences, especially as it relates to Lynn. Then we have combining data sources from disparate sources. And I kind of smile because Raghu is flying in this morning. That's why he's the second, not the first session. And we just hope that, it all works out. We have the backup plan, but Bill Bell is here to discuss the work from Census Bureau. And that's something that increasingly we have these data. People are saying, well, look, for us, I'm at NASS, we gave this information to the Farm Services Agency. They're USDA. Why can't you just use that? That's fair, right? And so we are getting increasing pressure. I'm sure each of you could think of examples where you, too, are getting those types of questions. Well, we got to figure out, one, what to do. Well, how to get it. Even though it's USDA, that's not always an easy question to get it, what to do with it, and then what are the quality metrics? How can we tell that we've done better, or at least as well as we've done that? Another topic that we're not going to cover today is sensitivity analyses, and we are planning the FCSM larger group, beyond this working subgroup, is going to be holding either a mini workshop or a seminar on that at a later date, so watch for that. And then in the afternoon, we're going to be turning to looking at frameworks for assessing data quality. In other words, we're looking for metrics. We don't know where the holes are. We're not the first one to have thought about this. So maybe we ought to build on what someone else has done. Paul Beamer is going to talk about expanding the total survey error metrics to more broadly, that framework more broadly to include all types of data. John Shaka, Mathematica, has been reviewing what's been done in other places, and we'll talk about those options. And then Frock is going to give a summary. We're going to have an emphasis on this last part, but she'll probably be synthesizing aspects from all three workshops. And some of you have already heard. She asked me if it's okay if she's provocative. And I told her, yes, please do. And I hope throughout the day, as you hear ideas, that you not simply sit and nod your head, that you think about whether you agree with this. And if not, let's just debate it. Let's have a good discussion. It'll make this workshop a whole lot more fun, and I would like to have a fun workshop. So with that, I'm turning it over to Richard.